Hello, everybody. Ladies, gentlemen, I am back from my medical hiatus. So, I don't want to get into too much, just know that I'm not at peak performance, and I don't think I'll ever be, and I've got a whole bunch of illnesses and symptoms. But, don't worry about me. I'm just here trying to do my best and, just do the work and, carry the fire, as Cormac McCarthy says. So, I want to warn you, this video gets dark. Now, if you know me, then you know that I'm a big fan of grainy or vintage photos from the 1970s to early 2000s. For anyone new, that probably sounds oddly specific, but look at some of my other videos and you'll see what I mean. So this video covers global wars of the 1990s that America, but more largely Western media, didn't really pick up on what was happening in the rest of this big beautiful world. So let's dive on in as we discuss this channel's 289th genocide. I don't know if that figure's accurate or not, but it leaves a bad taste in my mouth, somewhere between F-sharp and Pizarro. I'd like to preface this video with a clarification. What do I mean by wars of the 1990s? Why so serious? Well, viewer, if you don't get that question or aren't into history, you are more than likely Western, which means you suffer from a scalene case of privilege. Just kidding, I don't do politics here, except when I do. For most developed Western nations in the 1990s, times were good. We had the primitive internet, pizza, sitcoms, video games, Clinton, all sorts of other fun stuff and good times. However, not all of the places in the world did. In fact, more countries than not would probably regard the 90s as a total hellscape, and most Westites don't realize that. If you are from Eastern Europe, Africa, Central America, or any number of pockets around the equatorial region, life probably sucked. Most of it was due to the Cold War ending and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, meaning all these new struggling countries hatched from the egg and wobbly on their legs had to fill this new power vacuum. Conflict. America no longer had an incentive to come out of its shell and be the manipulative backbone of other countries, which meant many of them suffered in this new world without a political back and forth. So, let's start. The first conflict we'll be covering is the First Chechen War, which occurred from 1994 to 1996, and the Second Chechen War, which occurred from 1999 to 2009. Now, I want to get one thing straight. I am not Russian. I am not Chechen. I half do not understand this conflict myself, and I'm certainly not going to be taking sides in it. Now, with that lame disclaim out of the way, let's start. So, Russia in the 1990s was pretty foul, to say the least. The Soviet Union, world superpower for decades, had just collapsed into a bunch of tiny feuding states, with Russia being the largest and most powerful, and with Boris Yeltsin in charge. The whole dynamic of power in the Soviet Union was turned upside down, with a huge communist power suddenly turning to capitalism. As such, Russia essentially turned into a chaotic wasteland for a couple years after the collapse, turning lawless in some urban areas. There wasn't enough money to go around, and what little money was left became devalued and worthless, so many places and even whole cities fell into disrepair, becoming dirty, grimy, and filled with crooks. Safe to say, 90s Russia was an uncomfortable but nostalgic place to be. Now this is where the part where the Chechens come in. So Russia is a large place with thousands of different identities in it, but the Chechens are a special breed. They're located way down here, in this part of Russia called Chechnya, and they really shouldn't be called ethnically Russian because they kind of aren't. Ethnically, they're genetically Caucasian with some flecks of Middle Eastern and Turkic admixture thrown in. Anyways, they're distinctly not Russian, instead having a distinct Caucasian Muslim hybrid culture. They're mostly Muslim and write with an Arabic script, sometimes, or Cyrillic, and speak a totally unrelated Chechen language. Safe to say they aren't Russian. Historically, the only reason they're a part of Russia to begin with is because they were conquered centuries ago, but they've always been a problem for Russia. The region they're in is called the Caucasus, if you don't know, and encompasses the countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, as well as the southwest chunk of Russia, Chechnya included. It's extremely mountainous and chock full of tons of radically different ethnic groups as a result. While the Soviet Union was collapsing, Chechnya knew this was their chance to finally become their own country. They declared independence from Russia in 1991 as the so-called Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, or just Chechnya for short, and in preparation for this began clearing out all non-Chechens in the territory. A black market began in the tiny nation, based mostly on the transfer of weaponry, guns, and counterfeiting. Chechnya then put Dzhokhar Dudayev in charge, a former Soviet politician and Chechen military man. The Russians, who made up a significant minority and reeling from their collapse, weren't having this. In what appears to be a repeating move, the young Russia sent fresh, untrained conscripts to surround the seceding Chechnya and began a blockade. On November 29, 1994, Boris Yeltsin announced that the Russian invasion to recapture Chechnya had begun. For the next few weeks, Russia did an aerial bombardment over Chechnya and tried to capture the capital city of the territory, Grozny. Keep that name in your head, please. Also keep in mind that the whole time this is going on, the war is very unpopular back home since many Russians didn't want to see their boys die on the battlefield only 3 years after their country exploded. As months went on, Russia actually kept failing more and more. Considerable dislike towards Yeltsin grew and guerrilla resistance in the highlands of Chechnya mounted, making the mountains a dangerous place. Despite the siege against the capital Grozny, invading Russian forces were pushed back. Russia eventually did an unofficial withdrawal from Chechnya altogether in August of 1996, well, for a bit at least. But Chechnya actually won. The peace treaty basically said that Grozny would not have Russian troops, and the federal government would have to work with Chechnya to rebuild and also give it limited sovereignty. However, after the war, Chechnya was devastated. Russia suffered nearly 14,000 deaths in the assault, Chechnya 30,000. Wikipedia says that the number of affected Chechen civilians in any capacity can reach almost 200,000 people. In the wake of this war and rubble, radical Islamism began to percolate Chechnya, filling the void. Soon, pockets of Chechens became energized. It's now 3 years later. In August 1999, hardline Muslim Chechens, far-right nutjobs, and even foreign volunteers from the Mujahideen apparently, violated the previous peace treaty and Chechnya's limited sovereignty. They invaded the neighboring region in Russia next to Chechnya and their next-door neighbor, Dagestan. Dagestan is a nearly 3 times the size of Chechnya Republic and is very mountainous, and it hugs the Caspian Sea. The people there are a mashup of many different ethnic groups collectively called Dagestanis, and they're mostly Muslim. As you can see, they're in the same boat. Groups like the Chechens, Avars, English, Tartars, Nogais, Russians, Persians, and tons of others all swirl around this region with different identities. At this time, a series of domestic terror attacks began in Dagestan, spreading outwards across Russia, mostly by Chechen Muslim extremists to carry out their goals. Quickly, Russia withdrew its respective sovereignty granted to Chechnya and began a second invasion. This time, they made haste in nabbing Grozny in the year 2000. Pause. This second battle in Grozny was so destructive and brutal that basically the whole city was leveled, left in ruin, or smoldering. Frankly, it was close to being wiped off the map. The UN later said after the war that Grozny briefly became the most destroyed city on Earth. Back to war. Also in 2000, Yeltsin resigned in Christmas of 1999, meaning Putin is now in charge of Russia as president for the first time. So now, a younger Putin is in charge, so expect more butchering. Also, new Chechen leader, Aslan Maskadov. That's cool. Many human rights abuses were carried out as Chechen guerrillas paraded around the North Caucasus, attacking civilians left and right. For the next few years, terrible events like the Komsomolskoye and Beslan massacres would demoralize the populace and leak into international news. Now extend this out for almost a decade. This brutal nightmare continued for years until 2007, when the independent Chechen Republic of Ichkeria hesitantly agreed to be annexed again. It was not a smooth process, I boiled that down. In 2008, Grozny began to be reconstructed from the ashes under Russian help, and in 2009, the war came to an official close. 60,000 people lost their lives. Both Chechnya and Dagestan today live in an awkward, weird limbo as true 100% annexed parts of Russia, but the territories in many ways operate independently, still retaining their culture and traditions. But with Putin's puppet Ramzan Kadyrov in power, who knows what could happen next. Shifting our focus over to Mexico, we arrive at the Chiapas Conflict. So this is really comprised of three things: the 1994 Zapatista Uprising, the 1995 Zapatista Crisis, and subsequent socialist tensions which persist even to this day. So starting in the early 1980s, the governor of the state of Chiapas in southern Mexico, Absalon Dominguez, was oppressing the local native communities. Historically, Chiapas has had a huge indigenous population, hovering a little over 1/10 its population of a few million. In response to this in 1983, the Zapatistas, or EZLN, was formed by Rafael Sebastian Quillen Vicente, aka Subcommandant Marcos. I know this photo looks old, it's not, it's from the mid-1990s. The Zapatistas had been founded as a far-left, anti-capitalist, relatively anarchist group made with a significant minority of indigenous Mexicans, trade unionists, LGBT advocates, and guerrillas, not the apes, the fighters. They named themselves after the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata from the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Anyhow, the group stayed pretty underground through the 80s, but during the 90s, they became more noticeable. However, one terrifying, sudden warlord would disrupt the flow of the world: Bill Clinton. Clinton signed NAFTA in December of 1993, having it take effect on January 1st, 1994. NAFTA, for those of you who don't know, was a trade bloc established by Clinton between the three biggest countries of North America, the US, Canada, and Mexico. The Zapatistas were afraid that this sudden uptick in foreign business and industrialization would lead to the exploitation and endangerment of left-wing ideals and indigenous groups in Mexico. Soon, the Zapatistas came out of hiding and began to organize, capturing towns including Altamirano, Las Margaritas, Jovel, and Ocosingo. A few days later, Governor Dominguez himself got captured and was held hostage, with the Zapatistas later self-sentencing him to hard labor under their watch. For the first 2 weeks of January 1994, the Zapatistas swelled in size to a few thousand, fighting in the villages and jungles of Chiapas. For over a month this went on, until February 17th, when the Mexican government met with the group. Subcommandant Marcos met with a federal peacemaker, agreeing to the freedom of Governor Dominguez. Both sides agreed to a ceasefire in June. Problem solved, right? No. A year later in 1995, Esteban Moctezuma of the center-right PRI party met with Subcommandant Marcos in secret again in Chiapas. Peace was on its way until February of that year, when in a wildly unpopular move, the new Mexican president, Ernesto Zedillo, attacked the Zapatistas. Thankfully, the group didn't do much in response, so they signed the San Andres Accords in 1996, which gave greater independence to native communities and granted significant land reform. Now with Chiapas under a more left-wing atmosphere, it seemed the Zapatistas had somewhat reached a consensus. Oh wait, there's massacre coming up. Uh-oh. A little bit before Christmas 1997, a right-wing group known as Mascara Roja, with permission and training under the right-wing PRI government leading Mexico, went to the village of Actial, Chiapas. There, they began targeting indigenous Mexicans, pacifists, and Zapatista sympathizers, opening fire on them in a church. There were over 100 gunmen, killing 45 people in total. I don't want to go into details because it gets much worse, but the incident was famous for its brutality because not only did 45 people die, but the bodies were tampered with and literally the Mexican government sanctioned the massacre. Following that attack, a large investigation was done, and surprisingly, several attackers and government officials were charged, causing the downfall of the PRA party, thankfully. In the year 2000, a non-PRI president was elected, Vicente Fox. Fox attempted to make legislative changes, but they were very unpopular, and in 2003, the Zapatistas made their own provisional government. To this day, the Zapatistas have limited sovereignty within Chiapas. They continue to de facto control many parts of the state, especially in the north, but the government does not really recognize them, instead considering them as paramilitary and on par with the cartels. Several violent incidents have occurred since the turbulence of the 1990s, but with NAFTA gone now, they seem to have died down a bit. The future of Chiapas is shaky, but I believe they can pull through. You can do it, Mexico, I believe in you. Balkans. There, I said it. There's a lot to cover, so here's some basic preliminary stuff. For those unaware, the Balkans is the name of this region in southeastern Europe. It's known to be a pretty chaotic and complicated place because there are tons of different ethnicities and nationalities packed in a relatively small area. Keep these in mind. A nationality just refers to what country you're from, nothing more. American, Canadian, Namibian, Indonesian. Ethnicity is what people group you're from genetically, like saying French, Navajo, Chechen, Burmese, Italian. Yes, sometimes there's overlap. Okay, let's dive into a topic that I am going to heavily water down. I don't need to know where your loyalties lie, I'm just doing what the UN says. I know, UN bad, just give me a second. Okay, so, Yugoslavia, Southeast Europe, Balkans. Yugoslavia was a mad diverse place historically, home to Slovenians, Croatians, Bosniaks, Serbians, Montenegrins, Macedonians, Kosovars, and others. Many of these groups historically weren't big fans of each other's existences. Yugoslavia was a socialist country starting in 1945 until the end of its life, whenever that was. It was broken up between 6 republics, like states kind of. Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, and Macedonia, with 2 autonomous regions, Vojvodina and Kosovo. Different ethnic groups were all over the place, having little to worry about under their dictatorship. But first, let's get to 1980. Their longtime dictator, Josip Broz Tito, died a death. After this socialist domino fell, the nation's economy sagged and the government's control, now lacking a strongman, weakened. Emerging nationalist feelings arose all over the place. Enter Slobodan Milosevic, who you may have heard of. He was a Serbian nationalist politician during Yugoslavia, and now seeing an opportunity, snagged power. He became president of the Serbian part of the country, soon stripping Vojvodina and Kosovo of their independent statuses. Many in Yugoslavia felt this was a step towards dictatorship again, so the other republics weren't having it. Seeing the writing on the wall, in June 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declare independence. Slovenia was basically left alone, but Croatia was vilified in Serbia due to their usage of Nazi imagery and ultranationalism. Now hold your horses. I'm not saying that's all they did, I'm just saying it did happen occasionally. Slovenia backed out, and Macedonia also declared independence, also backing out. So those 2 are gone. Now for Bosnia. So starting in 1992, Yugoslavia was on its last legs. Bosnia was a mix of many different ethnicities, including Catholic Croatians, Orthodox Serbians, and also had a lot of Muslims thrown in. Its capital is Sarajevo. When Bosnia declares its independence in March 1992, all hell breaks loose. In response, the Serbs living there declare counter-independence in this territory here, known as the Republika Srpska. This territory was, like, mega backed up by Milosevic's Yugoslavia, which at this time morphed into a new country, really. Also, it was recognized by his Yugoslavia, and he put Radovan Karadzic in charge of Republika Srpska. In short, Bosnia was being carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. Milosevic allowed the forced deportation of anyone who wasn't an Orthodox Serb from the Republika Srpska, creating a huge refugee crisis across Europe. So this whole time, you have Croatia, who they themselves had a large Serbian minority in these areas, fighting against these rebels, plus in Bosnia, which eventually became a battleground between basically every side. Croatia was, in general, in support of the young Bosnia. At the same time, you have Milosevic's Serbia-Yugoslavia hybrid also fighting here and trying to form a greater Serbia. Bosnia is really not doing that great. In many of the territories Serbia is invading, terrible war crimes and crimes against humanity are occurring, including a lot of rapes, concentration camps, POW torture, firing at civilians, and urban warfare, not to mention all of the bombs and ethnic cleansings in the occupied areas. Also at this time was the Siege of Srebrenica. In 1992, the UN was sent to Bosnia as peacekeepers, creating safe zones. One of these safe zones was the Bosnian town of Srebrenica, but in 1995, the Serbs attacked from the Republika Srpska. Serbs quickly took the town within the week under General Ratko Mladic, and thousands of military-aged males in the town were killed, mainly Muslim, and many women were raped. The town was just destroyed. Also at this time, the capital of Sarajevo was blockaded and put under siege by the Republika Srpska for a few years, so that's not great. The Siege of Sarajevo was the longest siege of a city in modern history post-World War II. As the war dragged on, Yugoslavia under Serbian rule proved to be slowly demoralizing as their weapons and funding ran out. Additionally, Western support and weapons, chiefly from NATO, became too overwhelming. Western support mainly fell on the Croatians and non-Serb Bosnians, and Milosevic was slowly being seen as more and more unpopular. Additionally, Yugoslavia's sugar daddy, larger Slavic Orthodox Russia, was also not doing well since they literally just emerged from their previous confederation. The Muslim world, mainly Pakistan, was on the side of Bosnia since their fellow Muslims were being crusaded by the evil Orthodox Christians, so Yugoslavia was not seeing a bright future here. In a rare case, the US was actually hesitant to get involved, rare I know, but was urged by the rest of NATO. NATO eventually intervened, bombing the Republika Srpska in Bosnia with large airstrikes. For a bit, Bosnia got lit up during Operation Deliberate Force, also a feature of Clinton. Peace negotiations were eventually held in Dayton, Ohio, unfortunately, and in late November 1995, in the Dayton Agreement, it would be decided that in exchange for ending the fighting, for now, Bosnia would be united as one country, Republika Srpska and all. However, the nation would be divided between the Republika Srpska, largely Orthodox Christian and Serbian, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, largely Muslim and a mix of Bosniaks and Croats. The situation it's in today. Croats? I don't know. Now, please realize this is absolutely not the end of fighting in the Balkans nor Yugoslavia. There is still way more fighting in this war. This is simply the end of fighting for Bosnia. We have to move on to the next, but remember that there is still stuff with Yugoslavia becoming Serbia and Montenegro, Kosovo, and all sorts of others. Let's take a peek at what's going on in Africa at this time in the 90s. I'll give you a hint, nothing great. Here's just a hint. This war is frequently called Africa's First World War, and Africa had over 700 million people at the time. So a basic summary of what's going on in Africa. Ethiopia stopped being communist a few years back, there's severe desertification going on in the Sahel, which houses millions of people, the Congo is run by a neo-fascist dictator, and the continent has yet to understand the Cold War is over. Wait, what was that third one? The Democratic Republic of the Congo, an absolutely massive country in the heart of Africa, one of the largest in the world, and at the time, it was called Zaire. Also, you must remember that most of it is covered in the huge Congo rainforest, a big jungle that sprawls across Central Africa. At the time, Zaire was being run by Mobutu Sese Seko, who had some very slight fascistic tendencies, but was a US-backed dictator. Throughout the 1980s, which saw tremendous hardship in Africa, massive famines, and sweeping environmental disasters afflicted the continent. With the crazy leopard print antics of Zaire's dictator Mobutu, it was clear that the country was falling apart, and with the end of the Cold War in 1991, that was the last straw. The eastern half of the nation was in constant ruin due to the Rwandan genocide, which actually bled into other countries, mainly the eastern bits of Zaire. Regions in Zaire's east were basically lawless and run by militias, leading to tons of local power vacuums. The Congo is chock full of resources, meaning that it was now anyone's game to seize control. To top things off, Mobutu had prostate cancer, so he couldn't do some grand display of power in the east. This is where Rwanda comes in at. Rwanda had just gotten over a large-scale genocide just a few years prior. Many of the faces and groups responsible had crossed the border, making the perilous journey through the jungle and finding refuge in Zaire. However, now that Rwanda had some stability again, they knew the time was right to strike preemptively. Rwanda assembled a military alliance known as the AFDL, which stands for the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo Zaire. The AFDL was made up of Zaire's enemies wanting a piece of the pie, including Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and anti-Mobutu dissidents, more specifically, Laurent Desire Kabila. Kabila was a revolutionary and stringent anti-Mobutu, educated in the Soviet bloc, and partnered with the AFDL. In October of 1996, the AFDL's invasion began from the east. Led by Rwanda, the AFDL made haste in defeating several rebel groups, and even Angola and Eritrea sent divisions to help for some reason. Zaire really stood no chance, as Mobutu was an old dying fella, and his only ally was Sudan, which, to be frank, isn't that great of an ally. Now, the AFDL may sound like great guys trying to liberate Zaire, but remember, this is a 1990s conflict, so of course they're going to naturally employ thousands of child soldiers known as Kadogos. Looking at the map, you may think it's kind of funny how some of the smaller countries in Africa were able to launch such a harsh invasion of one of the biggest countries in the world, but that's only through the power of sudden violence. Moreover, the invasion was very destructive, causing ethnic cleansing in many areas. By May of 1997, the war had come to a close, though not without heavy losses on all sides. Approximately 250,000 people died, and was really more of a sudden violent release of decades of pent-up aggression towards the enemy. With the AFDL having won over half a year later, Mobutu had fled the country to Morocco, where he died that year. Zaire was renamed to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and switched their flag, both of which they share to this day. Mobutu was replaced with Kabila, remember him? But all was not well. Kabila was no longer cool with his former helpers in the AFDL. He was afraid they would coup him and put someone in charge who was 100% loyal to them, so he preemptively expelled everyone from the country who was part of his former AFDL. What a twist! Kabila now proposed a new alliance with all manner of different African countries like Angola, Socialist Zimbabwe, Gaddafi's Libya, and many others, though this never came to fruition. Of course, this prompted a new second invasion by the AFDL in the country which they just liberated. We're doing this again. This began the Second Congo War, which I have to wrap up unfortunately, but just know that it has the nickname of the Great War of Africa, which began in August 1998. It lasted until 2003 between the former AFDL and Kabila's DRC, now allied with Zimbabwe, Zambia, Chad, and a bunch of other good ones. Basically, 5.4 million people died, and it ended in a stalemate. Kabila remained president, and all it did was further destabilize the Congo. The war also employed even more child soldiers, violence galore, it had 100-degree jungles, it was just a mess. The whole war was just as, if not more, monstrous than the first one, and never needed to happen. Unfortunately, this is simply the spell which Africa is all too often the victim of. I would like to go into more detail, but unfortunately this is a very long script and I'm writing this at 1:46 in the morning. Just know that the Second Congo War was incredibly summarized and has far, far, far more going on than what I described in 7 seconds. This one is a bit shorter, but I still think it deserves to be mentioned. So we're back in Europe for this one, specifically Eastern Europe. Yeah, shocker. So the Eastern European country of Moldova today is the poorest nation in Europe. Moldova emerged in 1991 after gaining independence from the Soviet Union, which itself was relatively controversial since Moldovans are very close to Romanians. Both Romanians and Moldovans are essentially the same people group, culturally and linguistically, so some wanted the two to merge. However, fate went in a different direction. So from 1990 to 1991, many different countries throughout the USSR were declaring independence, wanting to pursue self-determination. Moldova was one of the 15 countries a part of the USSR. Moldova wants to pursue a non-communist future. However, two groups in the country are less apt. There are the Gagauz people in the south, who are not ethnically Moldovan. They're a Turkic people originally from Anatolia, but assimilated into Romanian Orthodox culture over time. They were not looking for communism, only more self-recognition in this new Moldova. The other group is where the trouble lies, Transnistria in the east. Transnistria just means the land past or near the Dniester River, which is this long river here in Eastern Europe. Transnistria was a part of Moldova, but had no desire for independence from the USSR, or at the very least, not with Moldova. See, Transnistria contained a great deal of ethnic Russians and communist sympathizers who obviously weren't too geared up for living in a non-communist Romanian-adjacent state. As you can very well see, Transnistria is a tall, thin slice of a nation whose western border is the Dniester River and whose eastern border is Ukraine. So in July 1990, a joint letter by Gagauz and Transnistrian separatists reaches Moscow, specifically Igor Smirnov, a Russian politician. This heats up tensions, not helped by the fact that Transnistria declared independence from Moldova in September 1990, and its de facto capital is Tiraspol. Guess who its leader is? Igor Smirnov. Soon after, bridges all over the Dniester River are blockaded. Gorbachev, who is still in power over the whole USSR, promises to resolve the situation, which ends up not happening. A minor skirmish between separatists and the Moldovan government occurs in the city of Dubasari, where 3 are killed, and it basically starts the war. Also at this time, in August 1991, Moldova declares total independence from the USSR. Around late 1991, Transnistria began cracking down on its internal policies. It demanded all remaining Moldovan security personnel still in its territory to be loyal to the new regime. Ringing in the new year of 1992, explosions rocked several buildings around Moldovan cities, and Transnistrian separatists blocked bridges across the Dniester, which is apparently a running theme. Acts of domestic terrorism began to spread throughout affected areas. It's also around this time, around January to June of 1992, that the Transnistrians receive heavy weaponry and grenade launchers by the Russian military. Dubasari is put under siege, as is another city in Transnistria, the city of Bender. Keep that name in your pocket. Russia now explicitly came out in support of Transnistria when in April, Russian Vice President Alexander Rutskoy visited the provisional territory. Fighting intensified in June of 1992, when Bender was put under siege even more, in perhaps the most famous battle of the conflict, though that isn't saying much. The Battle of Bender began when Moldovan forces entered the city under Transnistrian control. Huge urban warfare erupted when it became the Moldovan soldiers fighting against both Transnistrian and Russian forces. Several civilian centers were targeted. After heavy fighting, the Transnistrian and Russian forces won. On July 21st, 1992, a ceasefire was signed between the two sides. It spelled out that Moldova can still exist, but must give sovereign status to Transnistria, allowing them to continue using the hammer and sickle basically, and also allow Russian troops on its soil to maintain peace. This is the status that they continue to have to this day, and in Transnistria, where the USSR is still alive apparently, the Battle of Bender is looked at as a battle between Romanian fascists and Russian liberators akin to Stalingrad. Now look, I know this video was mad dark. Trust me, I study history. I know when things get grim, and trust me, this actually wasn't even the darkest stuff I've read. There are events throughout mankind's existence that don't even compare to this, so I've had to omit a lot of details to make do. Just remember, even though this stuff was terrible, please remember that things do get better. The world is getting better whether you believe it or not. You just don't hear about it because for whatever macabre reason, violent and evil stuff gets attention more than the positive. So please remember that all of these places are improving with time, but they won't get better if you dwell on the horrible nature of everything. Stick to your convictions and don't turn into a war criminal. I'll see you on the 4th of July. That's all for now. I changed my profile picture. Ice Cube out.